Good morning, I'm Adam Sexton. New Hampshire is a small state, but it has played an outsized role in standing up to Vladimir Putin's Russia over the last decade. Of course, Senator Jeanne Shaheen was famously denied entry to Russia almost 5 years ago now after being blacklisted by the Putin regime due to her support for sanctions. And from 2011 to 2017, her Senate colleague Kelly Ayotte was also a key voice calling for the U.S. to do more to stand up against Russian aggression. Former Senator Ayotte is our guest this morning on Close Up. Thanks for joining us, Senator.
Thanks, Adam. Great to be with you.
So in 2014, you were among those calling for tougher sanctions on Vladimir Putin and Russia after it annexed the country of Crimea, saying of the need to stop Vladimir Putin, quote, he's a bully and bullies only understand when we punch them in the nose. The people of Ukraine, it's taken a while, but they're the ones delivering that blow now, are they not?
They very much are, and they're so brave. President Zelensky has been inspirational, but also just average Ukrainians who are standing to fight for their country. I was actually on a conference call this week on foreign policy where women Ukrainian legislators were there. They had never held a gun in their lives, but they're now armed. They're staying in Kiev, and they are staying to defend their country. These people are inspirational, and the Ukrainians remind us that freedom is worth fighting for.
We mentioned your former Senate colleague, Senator Jeanne Shaheen. She's been calling for increased military aid.
Yes.
So far, the Biden administration hasn't chosen to do that yet. But what would you advocate for if you were in the Senate right now for the U.S. to do to help Ukraine, but not trigger an escalation of the conflict?
So I'm actually in agreement with Senator Shaheen that we need to get Ukraine the MiGs. They said they need them. We should get them to them. I think also anti-tank weapons. So we've gotten some of them to them, and there's a new package that's going to be strong, but we're going to have to continue with that. Also get them armed drones, and we need to make sure that we get them air defense systems. Those are primary tools that they need, and ammunition, lots of ammunition. Whatever we can get them to fight on the ground, any support we can give them. And by the way, this is going to have to be a persistent push by the USA, not just one where we pass the package now. We're going to have to continue to arm the Ukrainians because I think this is going to continue for a while.
What kind of a wild card are the nuclear weapons here? Obviously, it seems like the U.S. could be much more strident in its defense of Ukraine, if not for that situation where, you know, Putin right at the beginning, when things started to go sideways for him, was like, I'm raising my nuclear alert.
Well, nuclear weapons are a deep concern. I think, you know, they've continued to build their nuclear arsenal. They've updated their nuclear arsenal. And by the way, that's why I've been always for us to update and modernize our nuclear arsenal. That's important. That said, we need to do all that we can to avoid any kind of nuclear war here. And so if you think about some of the things that are on the table, I know that many have, and certainly President Zelensky, I can understand, has asked for a no-fly zone, and you can understand why he would do that. I don't support doing that right now, and I agree with the position that has been taken by NATO on this, because if we did that, we would, I believe, be engaged directly with the Russians. And because what it would require us to do essentially is shoot down their airplanes. It would require us, when they launch missiles from outside of Ukraine, to take those missiles down. And you can imagine that a no-fly zone would not contain the situation. It would actually expand it. But that said, we should get them everything they need, including those MiGs.
Is it more important right now to try to end the war or to try and go big and end Putin's regime?
Well, I actually think that Putin is on the downfall here. Putin is going to lose no matter the outcome in Ukraine. I think he underestimated the Ukrainians. He underestimated NATO's response and the world's response, and he overestimated his capabilities. And if you look at where Russia is right now with those economic sanctions, his economy's in deep trouble. He's also in a position where he thought that he could take over Ukraine in a couple of days, and he is stuck and bogged down right now in a real fight, and in many ways losing that fight.
What are some appropriate off-ramps, though, to give this, you know, dictator of Russia, you know, that could end the conflict and potentially, you know, help Ukraine at the same time?
So I think right now I don't see these negotiations going anywhere, unfortunately. Putin is someone who lies, and I don't think that he's a fair player to negotiate with. He often uses negotiations to basically stall as a stall tactic while he's regrouping, and then to go back and fight even harder. So I'm not optimistic about negotiations. I think we only beat Putin through strength, and that means providing the Ukrainians what they need to defend themselves, continuing to put the economic pressure on Russia. And I know that President Biden has a call with President Xi of China. If China chooses to provide support to Russia, then we also have to impose tougher economic sanctions on China. We cannot allow that to happen. We need to continue to isolate Vladimir Putin until his own people turn on him.
Putin has been very strategic, of course, over the last 20 years in doing just what he could get away with, essentially, without triggering the ire of the West to do more against him. But as you were saying, this invasion clearly was something, a strategic blunder, if you will. It just didn't work out the way he thought it would. That's on him. But to what extent do you think American foreign policy over the last 20 years created the situation that led to him doing this?
I think American foreign policy did. I mean, let's go back to 2014 when I was in the Senate and when Putin invaded Ukraine, Crimea, which is part of Ukraine. That was an invasion right there. And at the time, the Obama administration was asked to provide lethal aid to Ukraine to defend their territory, and they refused to. Now, on the Armed Services Committee, I supported doing that. In fact, members on both sides of the aisle supported arming the Ukrainians. That was a mistake. But as you look back historically, I think many administrations have thought we can deal with Putin, we can have, this reset moment, we can have this face-to-face with Putin, and somehow he's going to be a better actor and we're going to have a productive relationship with him. But he's played us time and time and again, and this time he's overstepped. And this is the time that we need to make sure that we are strong, we're together. As I look at what's happened with NATO, you think about what Putin's done here. He has brought NATO together in a way that NATO has not been together in 2 decades. And that was a mistake on his part, but we need to continue to come together, arm the Ukrainians, and put the pressure on Putin. We need to know who we're dealing with. He is a bully.
You mentioned several administrations there. In hindsight, is 2020, but you think back to President George W. Bush and the comment about looking into his eyes, seeing his soul. You mentioned Obama's attempted reset. That didn't work out. Of course, President Trump impeached for denying aid to Ukraine and making all of those comments, disparaging NATO and all of those things. How did this happen? Why did so many subsequent administrations get this wrong?
I think they got it wrong because they basically thought that somehow this Vladimir Putin was going to change. I think they hoped to have, obviously, relations with Russia that were productive, but all the telltale signs were there. Each time, when he aided Assad in Syria, and if you think of what the Russians did in Syria, it's a similar tactic to what they're doing in Ukraine right now. They're targeting civilians to provide terror within the population. So, right now we're talking, the President Biden said the other day, I think that Putin's a war criminal. He is a war criminal. He was a war criminal when he helped Assad in Syria. And he's obviously an even larger war criminal right now with what he's doing in Ukraine.
How will the outcome of this war impact what eventually happens with China and Taiwan?
Well, I actually think it's pretty significant. I think the Chinese, oh, there goes Siri. I think that the Chinese are looking at what's happening right now. They're looking at our response. They're looking at how strong we are going to be here. And also, I think whether Putin is successful. That said, I think the Chinese have designs on Taiwan. And what happens in Ukraine is not going to change what they are trying to do in Taiwan. So we need to be very vigilant there. We need to make sure that our strategy in the Asia-Pacific region is one that also continues to arm Taiwan, and also one that we are very clear with China that there will be grave consequences if they move on Taiwan.
Very interested to hear what you think about a discussion we were having on this program last week with Commissioner of Education Frank Edelblut, taking this invasion and putting it into the template of New Hampshire's anti-discrimination law, which was sort of focused on, stopping critical race theory in classrooms, but is very broad. And we asked the commissioner, and he essentially indicated that a teacher would potentially be out of bounds if they were describing what Russia was doing in Ukraine as flat out wrong. Now, do you find that problematic at all, that somehow if we were putting a moral equivalence between autocracy and liberty, between Russia and America, and not able to spell that out for kids in school, is that a problem?
Well, this is an interesting analogy. It's not an analogy I would have thought of. That said, you know, I think obviously there should be open discussions in the classroom about what Putin is doing right now. It is clearly wrong. It's in violation of every international norm. And we should have open discussions about what is right and what is wrong. That said, I don't think that we should take a viewpoint, you know, that anyone is better than anyone else. I think we need to treat people fairly and equally, and to me, that's very important.
One question outside the realm of Ukraine here, we wanted to finish up. You were obviously the Sherpa for Justice Neil Gorsuch in 2017. 5 years ago, it feels like 15 years ago now with so much that's happened in the world. I'm curious for your perspective on the Biden administration's nominee, Ketanji Brown Jackson. This has become such a much more partisan process, even in that 5 years since you were involved with it. Should
the Senate changed the rules when I was the Sherpa for Gorsuch.
But do you think Republicans essentially should just reflexively vote against this nominee?
I think the Republicans should obviously look at the nominee's qualifications. They should consider whether they think that she should serve on the Supreme Court, look at her prior jurisprudence, and, you know, like you would do with any nominee, carefully consider whether you would support her serving on the U.S. Supreme Court. I mean, that's one of your duties as a senator.
All right. Former Senator Kelly Ayotte, thank you for joining us on Close Up. We appreciate your time.
Hey, thanks, Adam. Good to be with you.